So you're looking for a 360 camera, but you're not sure which one is best for you. In this video, I'm providing you with a detailed comparison between the DJI Osmo 360 and the Insta360 X5. And by the end of this video, you're going to be well equipped to buy the camera that's best for you. I've used many different 360 cameras over the past 5 years, and I've used the Osmo 360 and X5 on many hiking, biking, and other outdoor adventures in the year 2025 so far. Now, one quick and very important note. In this video, I'm going to be sharing a ton of comparison samples with you. And in all of these samples, I'm using both of these cameras in either their standard or normal color profiles with all of their settings set to auto. And both cameras are also configured to capture the highest bitrate possible. So let's find out which camera is best. So a major feature of any camera is the sensor. And of course, on a 360 camera, there are two sensors. There's one on each side, and those sensors combined stitch one 360 image together that you can then later on reframe and export either as a 360 product or as a flat video. So one of these two cameras has dual sensors that are each larger than the dual sensors on the other camera, and that would be the Osmo 360. This camera has dual 1/1.1 inch sensors with an industry-first square design. In fact, the Osmo 360 is the first panoramic camera with an equivalent sensor imaging area of 1 inch. And the sensor imaging area of the Osmo 360 is technically even bigger than that of the Insta360 1RS 1 inch. Now, the Insta360 X5 has smaller dual 1/1.28 inch sensors. And these sensors feature that traditional rectangular design. Now, the reason that the sensor sizes matter is, in general, a larger sensor is typically going to yield better overall image quality, more dynamic range, and better low-light performance. However, in most cases, it's not that simple. There are many other factors that affect footage quality as well, and that includes how the data captured by these dual sensors is processed. DJI went with a bigger sensor and one main chip, but Insta360 went with smaller sensors combined with triple AI chips. So each sensor in the X5 has a pro imaging chip that processes noise and performs color and dynamic range adjustments before sending that footage from each sensor to a final 5nm chip that performs image stitching, stabilization, and highlight recognition. So with your first look at the comparison footage here, do you think the larger sensor on the Osmo 360 or the smaller sensors combined with the AI chips on the X5 yield better footage? But of course, it's still not that easy. There are additional factors that affect image quality as well, such as aperture and pixel size. Now, the aperture is very similar on these two cameras. The Osmo 360 has an aperture of f1.9, and the X5 has an aperture of f2.0. What this means is the Osmo 360 allows for slightly more light to reach the sensor than the X5 does. But pixel size is where it gets even more interesting, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the Osmo 360 has a pixel size of 2.4 micrometers versus the X5 that has a smaller pixel size of 1.2 micrometers. Now, why does pixel size matter, you might ask? Well, larger pixels in theory should result in a cleaner image with less noise. So what this means is the Osmo 360 theoretically should not have to do as much image processing thanks to those larger pixels. In addition, those larger pixels should yield better image quality in low light, as well as on bright sunny days, those larger pixels should provide a wider dynamic range. Although both DJI and Insta360 state that their cameras both have a maximum dynamic range of 13.5 stops. So looking at these samples so far, which camera do you think offers more dynamic range? Take note especially of the highlights and the shadows. In general, the camera that offers more dynamic range is going to have more detail in both the highlights and the shadows. Now, I mentioned low light performance, and we're going to talk about low light performance a little bit later on in this video in much more detail. But first, we need to talk about resolution and frames per second. So both the Osmo 360 and the X5 can capture videos in 8K 360. However, the Osmo 360 can capture in 360 all the way up to 8K 50 frames per second. And the X5 can capture in 360 all the way up to 8K 30 frames per second. And if you drop the resolution to 6K on the Osmo 360 and 5.7K on the X5, both cameras can capture in up to 60 frames per second. And if you reduce the resolution further to 4K 360, the Osmo 360 can do 4K 100 and the X5 can do 4K 120. Now generally, I don't recommend capturing 360 footage any lower than 6K in the Osmo 360 or 5.7K in the X5, because you're going to limit yourself with the quality of the export later on. In other words, if you go lower than that and try to export that 360 footage in 4K, it's going to look really grainy and low quality, and that's because you need a much higher resolution 360 video, because once you reframe it and export it, you're just taking a small portion of that entire 360 frame. And of course, that small portion is going to be a lower resolution than the starting point with the 360 video. Now, both of these cameras do offer a single lens mode, and I'm going to talk about the resolutions in those in just a moment. But while we're on the topic of resolution, let's talk about photos on both of these cameras. Now, photos may not be a primary use case that you have for these cameras, but both of these cameras are very capable with capturing photos. The Osmo 360 will capture 360 photos in up to 120 megapixels. Now, this resolution, of course, allows for an abundance of reframing and cropping possibilities later on. You can zoom in quite a bit on that photo, and you can still have a good resolution that looks good for a finished product photo. And the X5 photo resolution is a bit lower. In 360, it'll capture 72 megapixels, but 72 megapixels is still impressive and still offers plenty of cropping and reframing possibilities. And before we go any further, it's important to talk about color. Now, starting with the Osmo 360, the Osmo 360 offers 10-bit color in both the normal and the D-Log-M mode. And D-Log-M, of course, offers you that flatter image profile that you can grade later on. And one additional advantage of the D-Log-M is you can easily color match that footage from the Osmo 360 with other DJI products that also use D-Log-M. And this would include any other DJI action cameras or DJI drones. So if you own any of those, there is an advantage if you like to use D-Log-M. The X5, on the other hand, only offers 8-bit color. But the X5 does have an iLog mode that can also be used for grading. However, this mode is going to have quite a bit less flexibility than grading 10-bit. You're not going to be able to do a lot of heavy grading in the iLog mode. But it is worth noting that the X5 has a new mode known as Adaptive Tone. And Adaptive Tone is supposed to result in more natural colors and shadow details, especially in high contrast filming situations. So looking at this sample here, I have the Osmo 360 in the normal color mode, and then I have the X5 in the Adaptive Tone mode. Which of these do you like better? So before we move on, 10-bit and 8-bit, why does that matter? Well, what this means is the Osmo 360 with 10-bit can capture more than 1 billion possible colors. But the X5 with 8-bit can only capture about 16 million colors. So 1 billion versus 16 million is quite a difference when it comes to color shades. But you might say 16 million colors is enough, right? There are plenty of situations where 16 million colors probably is enough, and you're probably not going to notice a difference. But anytime you're filming where you have the sky in your frame, or anything that has a color where it shifts from a different shade of that color, you might notice some banding. So that's especially going to be apparent in the sky. The 10-bit is usually going to have a much smoother gradient than the 8-bit, which is usually going to show banding. And that's simply because 8-bit footage simply can't capture all of those different color shades and provide a smooth gradient output. So looking at these samples that have the sky in them, do you notice any difference between the 10-bit Osmo 360 and the 8-bit X5? Which do you like better? Now, before I get into one of my favorite comparisons with these two cameras, we do need to talk about several physical specs that matter a whole lot. And that first spec is storage. So first of all, the Osmo 360 includes 105 gigabytes of built-in storage. This means you don't have to have a micro SD card with the Osmo 360. And with that built-in storage, you can capture about an hour and a half of footage in 8K 30. Now, I still recommend getting a micro SD card because you're probably going to want to record more than an hour and a half of footage before emptying it off your camera. So I recommend always having a micro SD card along as well, because you don't want to run out of storage on your adventure. I typically have a 256 gigabyte or a 512 gigabyte micro SD card along with me, but it is nice to have that internal space in case you forget a micro SD card or in case your micro SD card gets lost. The X5, on the other hand, does not have any internal storage. You will have to have a micro SD card with your X5. And a pro tip to go along with those micro SD cards, make sure to check the DJI and Insta360 websites so that you can buy a micro SD card that they recommend to pair with their cameras. They do have very specific microSD card models that they recommend, and the reason this matters is you want to have those proper read and write speeds because that card needs to be able to keep up with that high quality footage that you're recording on your camera. So how about the weight of these cameras? The Osmo 360 weighs in at a relatively light 183 grams with the battery installed. The Insta360 X5 is a bit heavier, weighing in at 200 grams with the battery installed. And looking at these cameras, the dimensions are also a little bit different. The Osmo 360 is more of a square design. It's a slight rectangular, but it's mostly square. And the X5 is more of an elongated rectangular design. And it's worth noting the dimensions of these cameras also affect the screen size. The Osmo 360 has a 2-inch screen that is horizontally oriented, while the Insta360 X5 offers a larger 2.5-inch vertically oriented screen. And when it comes to mounting both cameras do have that 1/4-inch 20 thread on the bottom of them. In addition, both of them can use the magnetic mounting systems that DJI and Insta360 both offer. So if you own any other DJI or Insta360 cameras, the magnetic mounting clip with those systems, it will work on the bottom of both of these cameras. So if you're already part of one of these ecosystems, that is one less mount that you need to buy. Now, a very important physical feature is the battery, and in particular, battery life. And this is where it gets a bit more complicated. Let me explain why. So the Osmo 360 technically has a lower capacity battery at 1910 milliamp hours, versus the X5, which has a battery capacity of 2400 milliamp hours. So initially you would think that battery is going to give you more runtime on the camera, but the Osmo 360 in 8K 30 with default settings will give you about 100 minutes of recording time on a single charge, while the X5 in 8K 30 with default settings will give you about 88 minutes of recording time on a single charge. And of course, it is worth mentioning that both measurements depend on a ton of factors, including ambient temperature, which features you have turned on and off, a whole bunch of different settings. But exploring batteries further, the Osmo 360 does use the same battery as the Osmo Action 5 Pro. So if you already own the Action 5 Pro like I do, the nice thing is you can take that battery from the Action 5 Pro and you can bring it along on your adventure and have an extra battery for the Osmo 360. And in addition, the batteries from the Action 4, if you own that, those batteries will also work in the Osmo 360. So it's very cool to have batteries that are interchangeable like that if you're already part of the DJI ecosystem. The X5, on the other hand, the battery that comes with the X5 will only work with the X5. You can't use any other Insta360 batteries with the X5. But wait, there's more. Both the Osmo 360 and the X5 have endurance modes. The endurance modes help you squeeze even more runtime out of a single battery charge. Now, it is worth noting that the endurance mode on both cameras does disable certain features on there. So there are certain features you will not be able to use while you're in the endurance mode. So in endurance mode, if you drop your resolution in frames per second to 6K 24 on the Osmo 360, you can get about 190 minutes of recording time. And on the X5, if you drop your resolution in frames per second to 5.7K 24, you can get about 208 minutes. Now, of course, 6K is slightly higher resolution than 5.7K, but those resolutions are very similar, so those are the two that I wanted to compare there for the endurance mode. Now, I personally don't use endurance mode on these cameras because I want to have all features and the highest bitrate possible available at all times. I would rather buy an extra battery to bring along to not have to use the endurance mode, but it is nice to know that you have that mode in case you only want to use one battery, or in case there's a situation where you don't need all of those features and you don't need the absolute best, highest quality footage. And one more thing I want to mention, Insta360 does now sell a battery that's called the Ultra battery for the X5. And this battery features a whopping capacity of 2800 milliamp hours. Now, this battery does cost about $50 extra, but it does provide about 17% more recording time on the X5. And finally, one more hardware aspect we need to talk about before we move on, and that is the lenses on these cameras. So of course, on 360 cameras, the lenses do stick out, and this does make them easier to scratch or even break than a conventional camera. And both DJI and Insta360 do make it a point to highlight the strength and scratch resistance of these lenses. But what if you do scratch or break one of these lenses? What are your options for getting them repaired? With the X5, you can repair it yourself. Insta360 sells a lens repair kit for $30. And this kit includes a replacement lens and all the tools you need to replace the lens at home. The Osmo 360, on the other hand, does not feature lenses that you can replace yourself. But DJI does offer a flat rate lens replacement program. This means you can ship your Osmo 360 to DJI and they will replace a scratched or broken lens for $25 for a single lens or $41 for both. Now I will say, in all of my years of owning and using 360 cameras, I have yet to scratch or break a lens on any of them. But if I do, there is a convenience factor in being able to replace it myself on the X5. However, it is nice to know that DJI offers a low-cost replacement option in the event I do scratch or break those lenses. In other words, I don't have to go out and buy an entirely new camera simply because I scratch or break those lenses. So I do like the peace of mind that provides. All right, switching gears now. Let's talk about audio. Capturing great audio is arguably as important or more important than capturing great video. And this is especially important if your finished product is going to be a vlog or anything where having good sound, especially you talking to your camera, is important. So here's some samples of me talking with the built-in mic on both cameras as I walk along. So this is a test of just the default audio on both of these cameras. I'm just talking normal, I've got no external mic. This is just the sound as it sounds out of each camera with no special settings. And it's worth noting it's not windy today. So there is no wind that's fighting the mics on here. This is simply a test to see how good or how bad they sound. Which do you like better? The X5 has a built-in wind guard that should help the audio from the X5 sound better, but the Osmo 360 does not have the built-in wind guard. Now both cameras do of course have a built-in wind reduction setting as well. So if you turn that setting on, it is going to help on a windy day or if you're running or biking or have the camera on your car. However, if you want really good audio, I do recommend pairing a wireless mic with these cameras. And both cameras do offer options to pair a wireless mic. With the X5, you can use the Insta360 Mic Air or the fancier GPS preview remote with built-in mic. Both are solid options and yield great sound from the X5. This is with the Insta360 GPS remote / microphone connected. So this audio that's coming out of this, it can record internally in this device to 32-bit float, which is really high quality audio. So if you want to take this internal recording and sync it with the audio on your video later on, you can do that, which is a cool feature. And the audio from this should sound quite a bit better than just the default built-in mics on the X5. And with the Osmo 360, you can use the Mic Mini or the Mic 2. Both of these options also yield great audio. This audio is with the DJI Mic 2 connected. So I am getting 32-bit float audio internally on the DJI Mic 2. And then this audio is also recording in the file via Bluetooth. So what you can do later on with this is you can synchronize this internal 32-bit float audio with your video recording on the Osmo 360, and you can get that super high quality audio. But one advantage of the Osmo 360 is you can pair two wireless mics simultaneously. So if you'd like to have two people talking with different mics with both of those audio feeds feeding into the same video clip, you can do that with the Osmo 360. With the X5, on the other hand, you can only pair one wireless mic at a time. Switching gears again, let's talk about low light. Both of these cameras have a dedicated mode for capturing the best low light possible. On the Osmo 360, this is called Super Night, and this will capture video in up to 8K 30 frames per second. And on the X5, the low light mode is called Pure Video, and this mode will also capture low light footage in up to 8K 30 frames per second. So let's look at these samples I captured and let me know which one you think is better. Things I look for closely when filming in low light are jitter and ghosting, and that's because that electronic image stabilization combined with slower shutter speeds cannot always properly line up those frames later on. In other words, the motion in the frame from the slower shutter speeds is not always going to 100% line up in the footage, and it can make that footage look jittery. I also look for noise and grain levels, and I check how the denoising algorithms in these cameras handle the processing of the low light footage. So what I look for is I look for that over-processed look, because an over-processed look is not always great either. You typically lose a lot of detail, and things can look over-sharpened on the edges, but very soft on detail in the middle. So look for that when you're looking at these two clips as well and determining which one is better. Now, speaking of processing of footage, one of the most important steps with 360 footage is reframing that footage later on. And both Insta360 and DJI have mobile apps and studio apps. So the mobile apps you can use on your smartphone or your mobile tablet, and then the studio apps you can use on your computer. Now, at the time of creating this video, I would consider the Insta360 mobile app to be more feature-rich. The Insta360 app does offer more of those at this time. Now, of course, Insta360 has had many years to continuously improve this app, and it does show. DJI is, of course, brand new to the 360 game. So I would expect DJI to continue improving their app just like Insta360 has. But at this point, the Insta360 app is more feature-rich. But when it comes to that basic reframing, both apps offer very similar features. Both apps offer manual reframing with keyframes, AI reframing with tracking of subjects, automatic highlight options, and adjustment of image settings. And when it comes to export time, I do find the Insta360 app to be about 15% faster than the DJI Mimo app when exporting the same 4K reframed clip. Now, the Insta360 and DJI Studio apps also offer similar features to each other, but the layout of the Insta360 app I still find more appealing at this point. And this, of course, could just be that I'm more familiar with the Insta360 app, whereas the DJI app I've only used for a few months so far. Something else that relates to reframing and editing and is very important to know is stitching quality. So this first clip was captured on the Osmo 360, and I'm rotating the camera around continuously. This next clip was captured on the X5, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm rotating the camera continuously on the selfie stick. Which do you think handles the stitching better? And it's also worth noting when you stitch these files in their respective apps, you do have a few different options. For the Osmo 360, there is a high precision smart stitching option, which is going to give you the highest quality stitching, but that does come at a price with the export time. When you use that option, it will take about 3 times longer to export this clip than it will take to export the same clip from the X5 in the Insta360 Studio app using the AI stitching mode. But that being said, the high precision smart stitching that DJI offers does do a really good job. So we've talked about a bunch of different aspects of these cameras, but there are a few more features that I want to mention before I wrap up this video. And as I mentioned earlier, both of these cameras do offer a single lens mode. If you want to use either camera more like a traditional action camera, you can do that. On the Osmo 360, you can film in up to 5K 60 frames per second in single lens mode. And on the X5, you can capture up to 4K 60 frames per second in single lens. But how do both cameras compare with stabilization? I took both cameras on a run with me to test this out and to see which one does better. So while I'm running, take note of any bounce in the footage and also look closely if you can see any of the stitching lines showing when there's bouncing, or if there's anything that looks jittery in the footage. That's also a good way to test the stabilization. And speaking of motion, let's briefly talk about ND filters. Now, Insta360 does sell ND filters. They released them recently for the X5. So if you want to use ND filters to get a slower shutter speed with your X5, you can do that. The filters, they just screw on the outside, they lock into place, and they do a great job. I've used them, and they're very cool for getting more of that motion blur, especially on those bright sunny days when your shutter speed is going to be very fast. Now, DJI does not yet have ND filters for the Osmo 360, so ND filters will not be an option for the Osmo 360. And I don't know if DJI has any plans to release any of those in the future. Looking at the camera, it looks like it could be possible. I see a little bit of a groove there where maybe a filter could lock into place, but at this point, I've not seen any evidence that DJI will release ND filters for the Osmo 360. So if ND filters are an important feature to you, keep that in mind. And finally, one other thing worth noting, if you like having a cloud service that corresponds to your camera, Insta360 does have a cloud service where you can store, edit, and share 360 clips. And the service is called Insta360 Plus. And I have used it with my Insta360 X5, and it's been a pretty cool service. But of course, Insta360 Plus does have a monthly and yearly fee, but those fees I have found are very reasonable. DJI does not currently offer a cloud service, and I don't know if they have any plans to in the future, but I could definitely see DJI doing that. So if you made it all the way to the end, thanks for sticking around and exploring all of these comparisons with me. So did you learn anything about either of these cameras you didn't already know? Let me know in the comments below. Also, and most importantly, after exploring all of these comparisons, which camera do you think is best? I'd love for you to tell me in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn more about how to get the best results with either of these cameras, check out these playlists right here.